deployed, and there we go. Okay, so I just want to make sure that everyone can see my presentation and nothing else. I think that should be. Just give me a thumbs up, someone, if that's what you see. Awesome, awesome. All right, well, a good evening, everyone. Thank you for coming to this class. It's good to see you here. This is a bit of a different class than probably what you're used to, but I do hope you come with an open mind and with lots of questions. Hopefully we will finish this up with plenty of time for Q&A that you can pop in the chat, and we'll do our best. So since the 1990s, I've been preparing these types of classes, I would say mid-1990s, mostly for those originally in Europe, since I was on a mission team in Geneva, Switzerland. For those who are scientifically curious, but were maybe coming from a bit more of the, I would say, the atheistic, quote unquote, European atheistic community. But since being back in the States almost 10 years now, I really see an important need also for the very religious USA community. And I realize that most of the people on this call are believers, followers, but you may not necessarily be a scientist. And so maybe you found yourself having a discussion about God with scientists, and God put it on your heart to share God with them. But maybe the conversation got stuck someplace in the thread of the conversation about creation. And what I found in the past, maybe it's sometimes nice to have a response a little bit deeper than, well, God just did it, and there's nothing wrong inherently with God just did it, but in the spirit of 1 Peter 3:5, I like to always have that heart where we could be prepared to give an answer to everyone who asks, to give a reason for the hope that you have, but to do this with gentleness and respect, and I think that's key. So that should be our heart. I hope that is our heart, and hopefully tonight we could just kind of deepen our quiver of arrows for our scientific friends, and hopefully this presentation will be helpful to you. So let's go to slide 2. Okay, I'd like to read out of the book of Hebrews just to begin. This whole talk is about those 4 topics. To begin with faith, Hebrews 11:3. By faith we understand that the universe was formed at God's command, so that what is seen was not made out of what was visible. Now, as Christians, we believe that God is behind the creation, certainly. But to be quite frank, the Bible is, I would say, fairly absent of scientific detail, certainly 20th century modern scientific detail. And but as for me, I'm first a Christian. I believe I try to walk by faith. But that doesn't mean I think unscientifically. Just the contrary, I try to do my best as a scientist, as a physicist and mathematician, to think scientifically. So how can that be, you may ask? How can we be faithful and think faithfully and yet think scientifically at the same time? And I think the key is there's a right place and a right time. They should both keep in their lane, so to speak. Usually they're both completely compatible, but there are times when they can get a little bit out of whack. I'd like to share you a kind of a famous example when faith and science kind of got a little bit out of whack, and it led to a whole bunch of other things. So it was back in June 22nd, 1633, so a few centuries ago, when the church handed down the following order against the famous scientist Galileo. You might have heard of him. Famous astronomer, physicist. And the announcement was the following. It says, "We pronounce, judge, and declare that you," this said Galileo, "have rendered yourself vehemently suspected by this holy office of heresy, that is, of having believed and held the doctrine, which is false and contrary to the holy and divine scriptures, that the sun is the center of the world, and that it does not move from east to west, and that the earth does not move and is not the center of the world." In other words, Galileo was reprimanded for finding and discovering that the moons of Jupiter, in one of the first telescopes, that the moons of Jupiter orbited Jupiter. Well, this was heresy. That threw the entire religious worldview on its head. And since then, everything, because at that time, everything must revolve around the Earth, because of course, the Earth is the center of the universe, because we are God's creation, of course. Now, this false logic and this erroneous worldview was based on a misunderstanding of God, a misunderstanding, if you will, of the scriptures, and I would say a misuse of the Bible as a scientific book. And it's unfortunate because this event was not just obviously bad news for Galileo at the time, who was really penalized for what he thought. But it followed for the centuries afterwards that this created kind of a chasm between those who believe and have faith and those who think scientifically. And we've been ever under that sort of that spell ever since. Today, I would say the rift between science and faith is bigger than ever. And a little bit ironically, it's bigger than ever in the United States of America. So that being said, many think that knowledge is the key to truth. And there is some truth to that, but I think there's more to see under the rug. So let's talk a little bit about knowledge. Now, I'd like to, in this slide, and this beautiful circle or squashed green circle, if you will, consider knowledge. Let's quantify it a little bit. Consider this, again, this squashed green circle that represent all knowledge. That is all human knowledge, not God's knowledge, but human knowledge. Knowledge that ever was, is now, and ever will be. That's a deep slide, deep thought. We don't even know what our future knowledge will bring us, but we do know one thing is that it's finite. Okay, it's finite. It will not go on forever and ever. Now, let's draw a couple more circles. Let's suppose that we have an inner circle inside this larger green circle, and that represents our current knowledge. A larger concentric circle around that represents the knowledge that we will accumulate over time, and that middle circle, if you will eventually reach that outer edge of the larger green circle, but it will never quite reach it. It'll approximate it, it'll approach it, but it'll never reach it, again, because knowledge is finite. Now, even atheists that are into this type of thing would agree that, hey, knowledge is finite. I know some well-known scientists, for example, Neil deGrasse Tyson, some of you might know of him. My colleague at the university, Professor Sean Carroll, some of you might know of him, may disagree with me on the topic of God, but I do not believe they would disagree with me on the fact that knowledge is finite. So given that limitation, we could ask ourselves, can we prove God or disprove God? I think often that word proof gets thrown around, and I would like to say one or two words about proof before we really begin with the second part of the lesson. Have you ever had someone who's come up to you and ask you for a proof about God? In other words, show me a proof of God and I'll believe. And it's interesting. I had a friend back at school at MIT that posed that very same question to me back in the mid 80s. At that time, I didn't know how to answer him. This was before I gave a lot of thought to these questions. I was reading the Bible, but I wasn't really putting it into practice. I was still kind of I would say a novice in this whole thing. So I really had no way of answering him. And it was a very curious discussion, actually. You could find that in the memoir at the end of the talk here. But today I would say to him, there's plenty of evidence for God, but proof you will not find, because there's a difference between evidence and proof. Now, proof is found in the fields of, say, logic and mathematics. For example, you'll see in lines of proof things like 0 equals 0, 1 equals 1, 1 does not equal 0, 2 plus 2 is 4. Those are all lines and sort of lines of reasoning of math and logic. And faith, actually science itself, deals mostly with evidence, not proof. Physics, biology, chemistry, the physical sciences deal with evidence. It's only math and logic that deal with proofs. But for example, now, if I say to you, I have a pencil. I have a pencil right here, actually. So I have a pencil, and I say to you, what do you think are the chances that if I let go of this pencil, it will fall towards the center of the Earth at an acceleration of 9.8 meters per second squared? Now, probably most of you would raise your hand. I hope most of you would raise your hand and say that's exactly what will happen. And the reason that we know that is not that we have a proof. It's because we have tons of evidence. I've observed it. You've observed that in the past many, many, many times before. And lo and behold, that's exactly what happens. So it's really evidence that we're talking about, not proof. So the question that we really want to ask is, can science, really explain things? So the way we're going to proceed here is to ask the question, can science explain everything in terms of the physical universe? And if not, are there other explanations, either that remove God from the equation? And are those explanations demonstratable by evidence? If not, they are what we call philosophies, if you will. Okay? So we're going to proceed that way, and we're going to have a little discussion about that. Okay? So there are three grand areas where science has yet to put its finger on the answers to these three. And I think I've studied these out for now years, and I could confidently say that these three are pretty solid big question marks. However, I'm going to focus on the first one because that is where I did my PhD dissertation work around this whole topic of the origins of the universe, and we're going to focus on that. The other two are equally whole seminars in themselves. I'm happy to dive into that, and you could find that in the book that we will show at the end of the talk here. But we're going to focus on the first one. So there's a little bit of a background that you need for the origins of the universe. Okay, so the universe is fantastically large. It's in immense space, and it has existed for nearly 14 billion years, about 13.8 billion years. There's a lot of little details in that we're not going to dive into, but what is not understood is how the universe actually began. Now, remember Hebrews 11:3, we believe that God made something from nothing, but in physics, this just simply doesn't happen. We don't create things from nothing, at least certainly not on the scale of the universe. So what we'd like to do is quantify this occurring spontaneously. In other words, removing God from the picture and seeing just how possible this could actually be, because I think that would lead us a little bit to this journey of trying to understand the evidence for God. Okay, so the other important part of this whole discussion is that there's a natural progression of things. Things go from order to disorder naturally. It's Newton's second law of thermodynamics. And at the very beginning of the universe, all the matter that you see, all the light and everything was all scrunched together, very hot, compact, and it was in the form of energy, light, if you will, electromagnetic radiation. There was no matter. It was hot enough so that all there was energy. Okay, and energy is my real claim to fame in my research. So that's all there was. But energy itself can be ordered in something that physicists call entropy. Now, I'm not going to dive into the topic of entropy too deeply here. It's just that there's simple things that you just need to know is that ordered things with a lot of order in them, have low entropy, and disordered things have a high entropy, and nature only goes naturally in one direction. I have some caveats there, the details we won't dive into, but generally from order to disorder. So I would like to suggest that we explore this. The fact that the universe was a very low entropy ordered thing some 13.8 billion years ago is one of the most profound and unexplained questions in physics. But I think we need a visual example here. So what you see before you now is a messy kitchen. We say that this kitchen has high entropy or disorder. It is the natural state of things, and it may indeed be your kitchen at your home. But that is a messy, high entropy kitchen. This is a low entropy, well-ordered, clean Ikea kitchen. And the question I ask is, how do you go from that messy kitchen to a clean Ikea kitchen? Well, the answer is effort, right? You make a trip to Ikea, you invest, you do a lot of scrubbing, planning. It doesn't just happen, it's planned out. Order does not come naturally. So you might ask, so what is the probability that that messy kitchen, this thing here, transforms itself spontaneously, without effort, without input, without anything making that effort into that beautiful IKEA kitchen? Okay. And we're going to answer that. We're going to answer that. But first, let's look a little bit at that same question, but now for the universe. Physicists have been super interested in this question. As a matter of fact, this very prestigious gentleman before you, Professor Sir Roger Penrose, a recent Nobel laureate, and one of the teachers actually of Hawking's, actually Stephen Hawking's, and he spent some time just thinking about entropy of the early universe. Actually, it's a fairly straightforward calculation, which is really quite interesting. But he actually calculated an approximate answer to the probability, so the chance, if you will, that the universe just snapped into a low entropy existence. In other words, this question of saying that let's have a low entropy event is a little bit, it's a little technical, but it's a little bit like saying what is something that could just be snapped into existence. It's a little bit of the same question, okay? And the answer is it's a very, very small probability. It's actually very, very small. And in order to demonstrate just how small it is, we're going to actually explore a little bit of large numbers. And the reason we're going to do that is because if you flip a large number on its head, 1 divided by that large number, you come up with a very small number. So that's what we're going to do. And to do this, we need a visual again. So I love visuals, simple visuals. If you know me, I like making sketches. This is a very simple one. Let's start with just the number 1, okay? I'm going to make an X next to Sir Roger Penrose there. That represents the number 1. 10 or 10 to the exponential power. So I'm going to do a little bit of middle school math here, if you don't mind. So 10 to the power 1 or 1, 0 followed by 10 x's. Okay, that gives us a bigger number, but it's not nearly big enough for our needs here. 100, 10 to the power 2, 100 or 100 x's. Now we have a larger number, so we're getting there. But we need to go a little bit further here. So 1,000, of course, is 10 to the power 3, 1,000. I could put 1,000 x's on the screen. And then we can continue this actually now to 10,000. It gets a little bit unwieldy here. I can't even fit 10,000 x's on the screen. And we can go on and on like this. I think the next big step I put here was 10 to the power 10 or 10 billion. That's actually larger than the population of the Earth itself. So it's a very large number. But it doesn't even come close to the large number we need to match Roger Penrose's large number in the denominator of that ratio. So we're going to go to the next big step. The next big step, I'm going to borrow a little bit from history. It's a cute little story, and you might be aware of this, some of you, if you see the book behind me by Carl Sagan. It turned out in the 1920s, there was this mathematician who had this very interesting discussion earlier with his young nephew, and they wanted to come up with a big number. And what they did was come up with this thing called the Google. So Google is 10 to the power 100. All right. This is a fantastically large number. It is 1 followed by 100 zeros, as you could imagine. And I could have written that out here. But a Google itself is so large, to give you an idea of how big this is. If you count all the elementary particles in the universe, all the protons, all the neutrons that make up atomic nuclei, all the electrons, and all the subatomic particles that go along with it that are short-lived, if you add them all up, you'll come with the number in the entire observable universe of something like 10 to the power of 78, okay? We're talking about a number that's 10 to the power 100. Now, if you know about exponential notation, 10 to the power 100 is fantastically larger than 10 to the power 78. As a matter of fact, Google is so large that if I took and made the effort with my piece of paper of writing an X, on a piece of paper and writing out a Google, I could not fit the piece of paper I wrote that on in the entire observable universe. So large is that number with all those X's. It's a very large number, but it's not even close to the denominator that we need. So we're going to go to the next thing that famous or that mathematician with his nephew came up with, and that is 10 to the power of Google. We're getting there. So this is called the Googleplex. And as you can imagine, I'll write it a different way just so that we could actually look at it. With stacked exponential notation, you can actually write this out very compactly. 10 to the power 10 to the power 100, that's a Googleplex. So this number is so large that I can't even write it out with 1 followed by a Google zeros for the same reason I can't write out a Google and all the X's that wouldn't fit in a paper. I can't even write out 1 followed by zeros because if I did, the piece of paper I wrote it on wouldn't fit in the observable universe. But even a Googleplex is not large enough for us. We're getting there. And I'm just going to call this a big number. Actually, this number doesn't even have a name. When you get to be big numbers, you get kind of in a lonely spot. You get to these unnamed numbers, but they're so big. This is 10 to the power 10 to the power 121. It's a rather simple calculation that Professor Roger Penrose came up with. It has to do with the probability of finding all those ordered electromagnetic states in the early universe. And it is a fantastically small number. And what we're going to do is we're going to invert it. And there you go. 1 divided by that fantastically large number is the Roger Penrose probability. I mean, if you want something close to 0, this is about as close as you're going to get in anything imaginable. But just to give you an idea, because I thought this would be kind of cute. So I'm going to go back to my magic Ikea kitchen probability using the same mathematics and analogy that Professor Roger Penrose came up with. His number is fantastically small, but my number, 10 to the power 10 to the power 30, is also fantastically small. As a matter of fact, it's much smaller than a 1 over a Google. As a matter of fact, no one in their right mind would think that a messy kitchen could transform itself to a clean, ordered IKEA kitchen without some effort. And yet, physicists wonder how in the world could the universe have started and ordered itself out of pure empty space. I can't even say empty space. I would just say ordered itself at the very beginning. It's actually the same question. And this has been a continuous problem for physicists. So much a problem that what physicists usually do, or what scientists usually do, is come up with an alternative explanation. In other words, hey, that number on the left, that number on the right, they're both essentially 0. So let's come up with an alternative explanation that does not include God in it. And that's what they did. And this is something that you may have heard of. It's called the multiverse. Okay. So the multiverse basically is a very, very, very large region of space, of which our own universe is only a teeny tiny infinitesimal spot in the multiverse, and it gave rise to our own universe. All right. Yes, I'm talking about that same multiverse that Hollywood borrowed from and created like 2 Spider-Mans, 3 Spider-Mans, that type of thing. We're talking about that. It's a convenient way to get around the Roger Penrose small probability. And it does nicely fit in with some of the theories about the early universe. But I would claim that there's actually a couple of very major problems with the multiverse. The first one is that it's not scientific. In other words, it cannot be observed. Not today, not tomorrow, ever. You can never observe something beyond our universe. So it's non-scientific. It's a theory. And besides that, and the most important thing is just kind of kicks how it began cosmological origin can down the road, if you will. In other words, what began and what begot the multiverse. So it doesn't really answer anybody's question about the origins. It just kind of displaces it, if you will. And all I could say about the multiverse, you could tell I'm not really a fan of the multiverse, but I can say this: it's a philosophy, folks. It's not science. Now, I have some very distinguished colleagues that believe in the multiverse, and I get it. It does fit in with some theories, but it can never be observed. So if someone one day pokes fun at you because you believe in God, What you can say in a very loving way is that, well, what is the philosophy that you believe? And they say, well, my philosophy is the multiverse. That's what gave rise to us. And, it's my multiverse against your God. Now, if you're a skeptic, you might say, if I was, and I am a skeptic, and if I say, well, if this is all I had to go on, my God against your multiverse, I might be skeptical of both of them. But the interesting thing is I have more to go on, because if you continue reading out of Hebrews, it connects this incredibly small probability, which we call God actually creating something, with a bunch of things that can be measured, if you will, looked at, analyzed through history. In other words, it goes on to talk about people, Abel, Noah, Abraham, and a whole host of people that are measurable. It's historic. It's in context. It's about people. And eventually it leads to one of the most historically grandiose events, and that is Jesus himself, and the most central historical event of that, and that is the resurrection. All of those can be tested in line with things that we know in historical context, of which there is a lot of evidence. So that is something that I consider, is that there's this thread of learning that connects this most improbable event with very probable, tangible things that connect with my faith through very tangible things. The multiverse will stand out there as only an unmeasurable philosophy forever and ever, in my opinion. So, and again, even if we had some evidence, it only kicks this whole thing down the road. So I wanted to leave you with that. I'd like to finish a little early, but I'll just leave you with this last thought here. And this last thought is important. It is from the Proverbs, and I thought Solomon really penned this that it is really helpful. And that is, it is the glory of God to conceal things, to conceal a matter. And it is to search out a matter is the glory of kings. I would also say queens. And I think that's the most fantastic thing. In other words, we are created to ask and to seek and to better understand. So I'll leave you with that. You feel free to search out my website. I have lots of videos there on different talks. And if you're interested in this topic further, I give you those 2 books. You can find them on that website. So thank you for your attention. I'm happy to field some questions. I think we have some time for Q&A.
All right, that was fantastic. Thank you so much. My mind is still spinning from the numbers, and the numbers are too big to fit in my little mind. I think one of the 2 things we can do is, if you have a question, you can put it in the chat, or you can hit the raise hand feature, which will where is that? Where's the raised hand feature? Anyway, it's there somewhere.
It's under participants, I believe.
Is that where it is?
I think so.
All right. So any of you young people can chime in and help us out, by the way.
Well, there's a reaction. There's a reaction thing there too.
There
you have that on your screen. Yeah.
The reaction thing. All right. Thank you again. Questions?